Kevin, teach us.
Okay, so I want to dedicate this year for the Aliyah of the Shoma of Frank Tapneck, who I knew many years ago, was a lovely man, lovely family, and nice, good kids and grandchildren. He was very, very friendly, always friendly, approachable, and had many friends. And that is the hallmark of a good person, the people that are friendly with such an individual. So obviously something short is may the family have long life and be comforted at this time. So just a short idea. And the parasha that we read today, Parashat Kitisa, um, uh, one of the aspects of it was the golden calf and the smashing of the first set of luchot. So Moshe comes down the mountain and sees the Aaron and then the followers and the people worshiping the golden calf, which is a different story. We are at such a low level. These people on a high level, it's a different story. And sees that and is disgusted, smashes the tablets, and Moshe convinces Hashem to forgive the Jewish people, and eventually another set of tablets is created. And that was such a serious thing because it was almost like Avodah Zarah. And if Hashem forgave them, so it's a very tough thing. If we can forgive someone for doing something to us, it's a very good thing if we can do such a thing. So that was a very serious thing which was forgiven. So if we can forgive, it's not easy, and I'm not judging, or everyone is in a different situation. That would be the ultimate ideal thing to do if we can forgive people for doing things to us. It's a lifetime work and it's as a not so easy to do, but it's very admirable if we can.
I agree with you. I absolutely agree.
And Kevin, about the tablets, did you know those are the first cloud-based tablets to come out?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's very.
Correct. Yeah. That's a good
Yeah.
joke. It's yeah. Yeah.
Um, thank you. I wish Stacy long life, honestly, truly.
Yeah, same.
Um,
I saw that in the group.
and
Sent a message. Yeah.
let's do the share in that dedication. So where we end off last time was a simple premise. There, if you had a look, um, there's Rav Yosef and Rav Huna Bar Chia. And I heard a case of Rav Nachman, who basically ensured that the person that informed the Romans, for example, that stores of wheat were held by the leader of the Jewish people and had caused them to be confiscated, he would have to reimburse this person. And what Rav Huna Bachia said is, to Rav Nachman, does this ruling emerge from a law of damages, or is it simply a fine? And Rav Nachman said to him basically that if we learn in our particular Mishnah on this court case, we know that if the field was taken on account of the robber is obligated to provide the owner with another field. And the Mishnah has obviously also been established as speaking of someone not only occupied the land and it was extorted from him, but an informer who caused the land to be confiscated by extortionists. So we see from this Mishnah that normative tort law demands payment from one who shows his fellows property to extortionists. And basically, Rav Yosef said to Rav Huna Bachia, I'm curious as to what is the practical difference for you, because in either way, the informer has to pay. And Rav Huna Bachia said to Rav Yosef, look, if it is from normative tort law, we know that it's compensatory in nature, and therefore we can extrapolate from this ruling to other similar cases of causative damage. But and we said that causative damage is damage that doesn't have to be directly from your hand, because it's quite clear if you do burn down the field of another, you have to pay for it because it's caused by your hand. But here, it's speech alone. And is speech and action? No, that's also one of the chidushim, the novel ideas. The other novelty is that causative is indirect damage, meaning that if you tie a person to the beachfront and wait for the tide to come in and he drowns, the tide's drowning him because there's a delay in time from your action to the result. And therefore, is that an issue? And here you have one other issue, is that you've got what you call a removal process, that although you inform to the extortionists of this wonderful opportunity, you don't know if they'll take it up. So we don't know if you pay for causative damage. So that was the novelty, but you do, apparently, according to some opinions, so some Tanaim, that if the causative damage is under normative tort law, because we said tort law is compensatory in nature, what you've damaged, so too you have to give back as compensation for their loss, then you can extrapolate one case to another. But if it is a fine, in other words, it is a fine imposed because the person in Babylon is a chronic informer, generally they don't enforce knasim in Babylon, or if it's a case in Eretz Yisrael that it's not a chronic informer, but it's an informer nonetheless, then in that particular case, they'll issue a fine in order to deter others, but you cannot extrapolate from this ruling to other cases of causative damage. And that was Rav Huna bar Chia's assessment, that you can only do that with compensation, but not with a fine. Now, Rav Yosef doesn't necessarily agree. This is the issue. He's saying that, and from where do you know to say that we do not extrapolate from the imposition of a fine in one case to other similar cases? Even if Rav Nachman was imposing a fine, we can still learn from his ruling that fines are imposed in the case of causative damage. Okay, so how this actually works out is as follows. Is Rav Yosef's question actually opens up an exchange regarding whether logical reasoning can be used to extend a fine imposed by the rabbis as a penalty for one particular act to another similar act. Okay? So the Ramban Nachmanides sees this exchange as proof of his view of Rav Huna bar Chia's question to Rav Nachman. And according to the Ramban, Rav Huna bar Chia was wondering whether the general obligation for an informer to repay his victim is a compensatory payment deriving from normative tort law, or whether it's a punitive fine placed by the rabbis upon informers to penalize them for their behavior. So according to the Ramban Nachmanides, he argues the following way. If Rav Nachman's ruling concerns a one-time fine for a particular chronic offender, as Rashi would have it, all would agree that it can't serve to teach the liability of one who perpetrates causative damage. It's obvious that an analogous incident cannot teach a universal rule if it was only imposed in this particular case. So perforce, Rav Huna bar Chia recognizes that Rav Nachman's ruling represented a general law regarding informers. He was just simply inquiring as to whether that law was an outgrowth of the law of damages, or was a rabbinic fine placed upon all informers. So as far as that's concerned, let me just see if this means basically that Rav Nachman, who lived in Babylonia, no fine could have been imposed unless there was a chronic offense. In other words, habitual in nature. So it might very well be that in this case, Rashi agrees with the Ramban, that Rav Huna bar Chia was inquiring as to whether the general obligation of an informer is a punitive fine from a compensatory payment. So Rashi framed, guys, the question a little bit different, and he only framed it in terms of a chronic offender because that case would have to be tried and paid in Babylonia, and that would concur. So we want to say, is Rav Huna Bachir's assumption correct? That in fact you can only do this with causative damage. Because according to Rav Yosef, if it's logical in nature, why can't you do it with a farm? Why not? Why can't you extrapolate that from a similar case? So Rav Huna Bachir answers to Rav Yosef, you can't. And how do we know that? Because it's taught in a brisa of a different case. Let me explain to you what this means. I'm going to give you the case and explain what we talk about. Because in a brisa it said, originally they said that one who contaminates somebody's produce with tumah, or one who renders somebody's one nesech by pouring it as a libation for an idol, both these cases are indiscernible damage and you're liable to pay. Okay, so again, keep in mind, the one is you contaminate somebody's produce with tumah, or a Jew renders somebody's wine nesech by using it for idolatry. They're indiscernible damage and you're liable to pay. Okay, so just keep those two cases in mind because they do differ. So you take a product that is tahor, is pure, and you contaminated it, and therefore it causes the owner loss. If the produce was teruma, it may no longer be eaten by Israelites. Okay, it's only reserved for the Kohanim. But if it was chulin, like ordinary unsanctified food, it's rendered unfit for those who are careful to eat their food in a state of tara, purity. Now, not every Jew was holding at that madrega. But if the owner was such a person, he's lost the use of his produce. Because if he himself does eat tameh food, impure food, but still kosher, but it's considered affected by a sheretz or a dead body near him, he still suffered a loss because the produce can't be sold to those who eat only tahor food. So there was only a small amount of Jews that were not stringent in this regard. So it's a loss, but it's an indiscernible loss. And you've got the same thing with nesech. So nesech is one that's been used for idol worshipping libation. So like in Talmudic parlance, the phrase nesech wine refers specifically to one that has been used not for holy libation, but for idolatrous libation. It's biblically prohibited to consume the wine. You also cannot derive any benefit from the wine, such as selling it or earning money from it or giving it as a gift. That's in the Gemara Avodah Zorah 29b. So one who pours his fellow's wine as a libation for an idol has caused the owner a financial loss. Now, this is the careful thing, is in both these cases, there's no discernible damage. In other words, the damage can't be detected by physical means. It's legal, but not physical damage. So we use the example of if you leave wine in the sun and it turns sour to vinegar, you've affected the quality of the wine that is discernible by the palate. But here, the quality of the wine hasn't changed. It's just prohibited to use it for Torah reasons. So there's a biblical rule about indiscernible damage that is technically not considered damage because it's not measurable with standard metrics. So this means that by biblical law, one who inflicts indiscernible damage upon another person's property is not liable, biblically. Although one who renders wine nesech commits an act of theft when he takes the wine to pour it, that still wouldn't render him liable to pay, because for the wine, to the eye is undamaged, to the palate is undamaged. And all the guy has to do is bring the wine before the guy who originally owned it and said, listen, your wine is before you. So since he returned it to the owner, he need not pay for it. So by biblical law, Deraisa, this person isn't liable. He is, however, liable by rabbinic decree, to Rabbanan, because the rabbis imposed a fine. Why? Upon one who deliberately perpetrates an act of indiscernible damage in order to deter people from making this sort of sin against another Jew. So they've provided a mechanism of a deterrent. Okay, this is very important to know. Now, they're using another case, and this happened quite a bit later in the Gemara. And they later said that one who mixes teruma into someone's chulin produce And it's another case of indiscernible damage, is also liable to pay. So, if you mix truma with chulin, it renders the entire admixture prohibited for non-Kohanim. So it causes the owner loss because he's got to sell the entire mixture to a Kohen for a reduced price of teruma, according to Rashi. Because according to the Gemara, truma is worth less than ordinary produce because it's got to be eaten only by the Kohanim and not the general population. And only the Kohanim that are tahor, because Kohanim that are in a state of purity is only a portion of the Kohanim. Sometimes there's a seminal mission, etc., and they also have exposure, which they have to go in the mikveh. So this truma is only a select group within the Kohanim. So as your market shrinks, your ability to sell it to a wider audience diminishes, and so too, if none of the Kohanim want to buy it you in a pickle, so your price is reduced in order to get them to take the bait. Moreover, should the truma itself become tameh, in other words, the truma at this stage is pure, but if it becomes in a state of impurity, tameh, it becomes entirely forbidden for consumption. So these three cases of indiscernible damage are enumerated in Gittin 52b. So the Mishnah rules that one who commits any of these acts is liable by rabbinic decree. So the Brisa tells us that originally it was thought that the decree applies only in two of the cases. Let's study what they are. It's the first case, that one who contaminates produce and makes it tumah, and that one who renders wine nesek by using it for idolatrous libation. But later it was recognized that it applies as well to one who mixes truma with someone's chulin. Okay? Now, it should be fairly, so far everything is fairly straightforward. Now, let's just see. Okay, so we've got to look at the timeline here. So what does this imply by the last case? That because later they expressly included the case of one who mixes truma into somebody's chulin, obviously, yes, he's liable. But had they not later included this case, he wouldn't be liable. So what the Gemara is trying to say is, if it didn't say at the end, if you mix somebody's truma with chulin, you would be liable, you wouldn't be. So why is it that it mentioned it later? Is it perhaps the reason that the Gemara is trying to suggest? Not because the liability for indiscernible damage is a fine, and we don't extrapolate from the imposition of a fine in one case to other similar cases. In other words, the Brisa's statement that they later said indicates that had they not later taught this aspect of the law, we would not have said on our own that one who mixes truma into another person's chulin is liable, even though the principle can be extrapolated of indiscernible damage. Because that's to say that we don't extend the fine imposed upon one who contaminates produce or renders wine nesak to one who mixes truma into somebody's chulin, even though it's the same concept. So Rav Huna Bachia wants to say to Rav Yosef that this maintains proof that because we generally do not extrapolate from a fine imposed in one case to other similar cases, and this is proof of it, accordingly, if the reason that an informer is liable is that the rabbis imposed a fine upon them and it's not rabbinical, we can't infer basically from the one law that if you perpetrate a similar law, that causative damage is where the fine is based on, and therefore there's liability. Okay? So, I mean, Tosfot's got an answer. Says, look, he doesn't really agree with Rav Huna Bach here. He sees it from Rav Yosef's perspective. He says, okay, granted, you can't extend a fine from one case to another, but why would the rabbis impose the fine in one case and not in the other? In other words, at the same time, they mention all three cases separately, but it's not an extrapolation. They're three separate cases. And Tosfot answered that decrees are always sparked by incidents in law. In other words, whenever law is passed, it's because there's an incident, and therefore that law sets a precedent of similar cases in the future. But the reason being is there weren't really any incidents in which truma was mixed in somebody's chulin. it's different to whether something becomes tumah. I mean, it's very possible, and it's very different when you've got an idolatrous practice of a libation. But truma was kind of hard to come from, because the truma would be given to the Levi, and then the Levi would give it to the Kohen. So therefore the Levi must have messed up here and mixed it into a normal person's chulin. And because that's pretty unlikely, the rabbis never imposed a fine in such a case, because there was no point of previous law history. They just added it in case that case would come up. But Rav Huna Bachir maintains that the reason why it wasn't extrapolated beforehand is simply you can't take the case of one fine, base it on a logical principle, and extend it to other fines, because it's not compensatory in nature, at which normative tort law would apply in application through logical extension. So that's his answer to Rav Yosef. Now, Rav Yosef dismisses this proof. Am I with you guys so far? Well, are you with me? I'm with you. I'm always with you.
So,
Extending a fine to two different cases.
No. Let's go back a step, Kev.
To explain that, I didn't. It sounds okay.
Explain what's at issue here. That's what I want you to explain to me. What's this whole issue here with fines versus compensation? What's the argument between Rav Yosef and Rav Huna Bachir?
Okay. I'll give it a go. Okay, so if something is rendered completely useless like yayin nesek, where it's the wine is used for idolatrous purposes, then it can't be used for libations.
Okay.
But but I'm not sure about if truma is mixed with chulin, maybe it's not as bad, but it's also can't be used by the Kohen can't eat it, can't consume it.
Okay,
So
so
it goes to waste.
you're onto a good point there, is that it's not as bad. It's an issue that you've hit the nail on the head, is that it is going to come back later. If you're comparing cases, they have to be similar in terms of the amount of damage caused. So you're onto the right track. Where you're a little off is that a truma can be consumed by a Kohen. You see, this is where the law changes from today.
It's mixed with chulin you're talking about.
Yeah. So if it's mixed with chulin,
Okay.
no Israelite can have it, but only the Kohen can. And
Okay, because it's the truma portion. There's truma within the because
yes, correct.
only kohanim are eligible
But
to eat truma.
You're right in that you can sell it to other kohanim. See, look what happens today. Today, if you produce Chalav Yisrael milk and people need Chalav Yisrael milk, even though it's a smaller market, you can get your asking price. It's the price of cocaine a gram or a liter if you look at Chalav Yisrael milk in South Africa, because Rabbi Yoram Bugach produces it, and it's for a very selected small audience, and therefore he's got a lot of expenses and he needs to recover it, so they're prepared to pay. So price for something exclusive is high, okay, and something that can be sold to the masses is lower, because your general affordability has to be that you market it to the maximum amount of people. But then it was the opposite way around. It seemed as though that if only the Kohanim could use it, that kind of like say, well, this is what we're prepared to pay, no more, and you were at the mercy of the Kohanim. So you had to sell it for a lower price. It's opposite to today's market principles. But the point of it is there would be some loss suffered if you have to sell it at a lower price to the Kohanim. But I want to know from you, Kevin, the principle of why this whole issue was brought up about truma, chulin, libations. What are we getting at? What is this whole discussion about? That's what I want to know from you. What's Rav Yosef's opinion, and what is Rav Huna Bachir's opinion?
It's compensation and funds and
okay, but what are we trying to learn from it?
Can't tell you.
Okay, Arthur. He's looking so comfortable there. We have to shake.
You get such a good comfortable answer. You asked that question. Well, there's a difference between compensations and fines, first of all. Okay. Compensation, a fine is something you've actually done, and a compensation is what you get back. I'm trying to think. Anyway, a fine is if you've had to take it to if you actually had to, let's say, take it, like when you go, if you have to go to court, you get a fine. Okay. Compensation is giving back to the person that you wronged the right thing, the right amount.
Okay, so in modern terms, Arthur is right. If you get a traffic fine, it's because it's not that you going over the speed limit has damaged somebody else. It's a law to constrain you from speeding where you could create damage. And therefore, it's not as compensation for a car you hit. So Arthur's got a good
Yeah.
point there. But how does this relate to extrapolating law?
You notice I didn't become a lawyer, right?
Gavin, what is tort law?
Probably noticed.
Not
No,
law
so
that you teach.
I've got a bit of a bad brain fog, but I did follow that part, I think. So I'll give it back to you, that part.
Good, good,
So
good.
the part I think the answer I think you're looking for, this is all I know. So don't ask me anything else. But hopefully it's the right answer. I'm hoping it is the fact that tort law and causative works on tort law, I think, if I remember correctly. And you can extrapolate from causative damage. You can extrapolate from causative cases or tort law cases, but you can't extrapolate from fines, because fines are often, for the most part, they seem to be, because they're unique to that individual. But if it's reoccurring fine, then there are some rabbis, I can't give you who they are. They say that you can extrapolate because it's not a once-off fine. So it's a recurring thing, which means it's a repetitive thing. So it can apply to other people doing the same type of thing regularly. I think that's what you said.
Okay, so Gavin's very close and he's got a lot right. The only issue, Gavin, where the compulsive nature of an informer is brought into play is only in Babylon. So, for example, in Eretz Israel, if you get a fine imposed upon you for speeding your car, I'm just using an example, speeding your donkey past the speed limit. Chickadee, 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 chick, okay? And you go past the speed limit and they impose a fine. In Eretz Israel, they'll give you a fine. In Babylon, the rabbis did not impose fines, okay? All they did is impose compensatory damages, which is part of normative tort law. Tort law is stating for the wrong that you commit against another, you have to have restitution to make sure that they are not at a loss. That's all it is. It's ways and measures to right the wrong you've caused. And what we are saying is here is that according to the Ramban and Rashi, you would have to have a case of a habitual informer, because it's the only way that when this case occurred with Rav Nachman in Babylonia, that the fine could be imposed. That was the only reason we were talking about a chronic informer, so to speak. It's because how was this case enforced by Rav Nachman in Babylonia? Only because this guy's done it before. But the issue isn't if he's done it before or not. It just explains why he was forced to pay this fine in Babylonia, if in fact it was a fine and not a compensatory payment. Because in Eretz Yisrael, there's no question you pay a fine. That was a side note. The main issue is exactly also as you mentioned, is that is it compensatory payment or is it a fine? Because according to Rav Huna Bar Chia, if it's a compensatory payment, you can take this case and extrapolate it to similar cases. Okay, similar cases. If it's a fine, even by logical deduction, if other cases are similar, you can't extrapolate one fine to another case and issue another fine because it's rabbinic, it's not biblical. And a perfect example is causative damage or indiscernible damage, because it's not direct. Okay, it's not like you burnt down the field. You told somebody to burn down the field. And therefore, this is particularly why this issue of final compensatory payment comes. Because if it's indiscernible or causative in nature, in other words, indirect, then it would be rabbinic decree, according to some opinions, at which it would be a fine. And therefore, you can't learn this case and extrapolate it to other cases. If, according to some opinions, the causative damage is in fact as bad as direct damage or you using your own hands instead of speech, then it's compensatory in nature. And therefore, if you're an informer, if you want to say it's compensatory in nature, you have to hold by the opinion of some of the Tanaim that causative damage, which is indirect damage, is the same as direct in taking the field and stealing it from somebody. So since we're dealing with indiscernible damage or causative damage, in our case by being an informer, in other words, nothing real was done. It was it's like the wine that was damaged, the truma. It's not something you can see, and it's not something where you used your own hands to damage. Is it rabbinic and therefore a fine, or is it biblical and therefore compensatory in nature? And if it's compensatory, you can learn similar cases. It's a fine, you can't. And that's according to Rav Chia by Rav Huna bar Chia. But according to Rav Yosef, he says, why can't you learn a fine in similar cases if the logical principle is identical? And Rav Huna bar Chia is saying you can't for this exact reason. And he was taking the first case of saying, look, you've basically allowed somebody's wine to have tumah in, and therefore you've rendered it unfit for using. Or a Jew has made sure that he stole wine and he used it for idolatrous libations, and therefore when he returned it to the guy, biblically, he did nothing wrong because he says your wine is before you, but rabbinically, you can't use that wine, even though the wine is intact, the same quality as it was, because it's forbidden to use, and therefore it's only rabbinically that you can make it a fine to force this person to pay so the person doesn't have the loss. And because the third case was added later about somebody's truma being put into chulin, and we are told that the rabbis had to say that, otherwise you never would have believed that the person is liable, is Rav Huna bar Chia's proof that we had to be told, because the other two were fines, and therefore, if this is a fine, if it was logically deduced, why couldn't you have extrapolated the concept of a fine from a case that's similar to the later case? And he's saying that's a proof that you're not allowed to, and therefore it was a fine. That's his proof. And we'll end off on that note before we get more complicated.
Just
But I
repeat
think
that,
we
please,
dealt with
Damon.
a great deal.
Damon, please just repeat that last point.
Okay, his proof that it was a fine is that why would you need a later case of them saying they later added that if you mix somebody's trum and chulin, in that particular case, you have to pay for indiscernible damage, because surely it's similar to the first two cases, which proves it's a fine. Because according to him, Rav Huna bar Chia, if it was a fine and you could deduce it logically, you wouldn't have to be told later by the third case, because it's so similar to the first two. The fact that you have to be is proof that it's a fine, and you can't extrapolate logic in similar cases from a fine. That's his argument to Rav Yosef. Tosfot agrees with Rav Yosef, and he's saying that basically the reason why the third case was only added later is you can only learn principles when there's actual cases that have been happened in history. But Rav Huna bar Chia would say to that it's not true, because what the whole point of law is, you set a precedent based on the principle. And therefore it was a fine and not compensatory in nature, which proves indiscernible damage or causative indirect damage by speech of an informer is a fine in nature, and but you can't learn a case of one fine to another fine, even if it's logical. And that's why I wanted to know from Rav Nachman, is this a final compensatory damage? So we know, with regards to an informer, what to do in similar cases. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.